She didn't beg for food, she offered something else, and in a town where people had learned to look away, that choice would echo longer than anyone expected. "Take me. I will bear you children," she said, her voice steady in a way that only comes when there are no options left, and the man she said it to was the last man anyone trusted, a quiet figure on the edge of everything, known more by rumor than by truth, a man people avoided not because they understood him, but because they didn't. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Clara Hayes, and her story mirrors many recorded accounts from early American frontier settlements where widowed women, facing hunger and social exclusion, made decisions that blurred the line between survival and sacrifice, and while the details vary across archives and oral histories, the pattern remains the same: isolation, scarcity, and a community that quietly decided who was worth saving. Clara had not always lived like this. There was a time when her home had warmth, when meals were shared without counting portions, when laughter filled the spaces that silence would later take over, but loss has a way of arriving without warning, and in her case, it came in the form of illness that took her husband and with him the stability that held her world together. What followed was not immediate ruin, but something slower, something that wore her down day by day. Neighbors who once greeted her now spoke in shorter sentences, help that once came freely began to feel conditional, and eventually, it stopped altogether, not because people didn't see her struggle, but because they chose to believe it wasn't theirs to carry. Days turned into calculations, how long food could stretch, how far dignity could bend, and when those two finally collided, Clara made the kind of decision that people judge easily from a distance but rarely understand up close. The man she approached, we'll call him Elias Boone, had built a life apart from the town, not entirely outside it, but never fully within it either, a man whose past was discussed in fragments, none of them confirmed, all of them repeated often enough to become accepted as truth, and yet no one could point to a moment where he had actually done what they feared, only that he could. That afternoon, when Clara stood in front of him, what the town saw was a transaction, something uncomfortable, something they could shake their heads at and walk away from, but what they didn't see was the moment before she spoke, the hesitation, the weight of every door that had closed before she reached his, the understanding that this was not a choice between right and wrong, but between surviving and disappearing quietly in a place that had already begun to forget her. When she said those words, it wasn't just an offer, it was a reflection of what she believed she had become, and when Elias listened, really listened, something shifted in a way no one watching could have predicted, because while they expected him to accept for the reasons they understood, his reasons were tied to something the town had never cared to learn. What happened after that moment would challenge every assumption they had made about both of them, but the truth behind that moment was far more complicated than anyone realized. Clara Hayes did not arrive in Hollow Ridge as a stranger, but by the time this moment unfolded, she had become one in every way that mattered, a familiar face reduced to quiet glances and unspoken assumptions, a woman people recognized yet chose not to know, and desperation has a way of reshaping how a person is seen, turning dignity into something others measure instead of respect. What made her stand in front of Elias Boone that day was not sudden impulse, but the slow erosion of every other option, a series of small rejections that built into one final decision. And yet the question that lingered was not just why she said those words, but what had been taken from her long before she ever spoke them. Elias Boone, on the other hand, existed on the edge of Hollow Ridge in a way that made him both visible and unreachable, a man defined by distance, not just in where he lived, but in how people spoke about him, as if keeping him separate made their own lives feel safer, and while no one could point to a clear reason for their fear, they held onto it tightly, because fear is easier to maintain than understanding. So when Clara Hayes stood before him and made that offer, it forced a collision between two people the town had already decided it understood, even though it never truly did, and what followed would challenge that certainty in ways no one was prepared for. Who was Clara Hayes before desperation brought her here, and how much of her story had been rewritten by the silence around her? Why would a woman choose to define her worth in such a way unless something deeper had already convinced her she had no other value left to offer? And perhaps more unsettling, why did Elias Boone, a man who kept his distance from everyone, accept without hesitation, not with visible urgency or desire, but with a quiet decision that seemed almost deliberate. The town watched closely, forming conclusions before facts had the chance to surface, seeing danger where there might have been something else entirely, judging Clara's vulnerability as weakness while overlooking the strength it took to stand there at all, and this contrast between what was seen and what was true began to widen with every passing moment. Fear stood on one side, shaped by rumors and distance, while vulnerability stood on the other, exposed and undeniable, and somewhere between those two, the truth waited, unnoticed, as Clara Hayes walked away with Elias Boone, leaving behind a town that believed it had just witnessed the beginning of a story, when in reality, it had already missed the most important part. Before Hollow Ridge learned to define her by that single moment, Clara Hayes had lived a life that followed a quieter, steadier rhythm, the kind built on routine, shared responsibility, and the belief that tomorrow would resemble today in all the ways that matter, and for a long time, it did. She had a home that held warmth even in difficult seasons, a husband who worked hard enough to keep hope within reach, and a place in the community that felt secure, not because it was guaranteed, but because it had never been tested. That changed with a kind of suddenness that leaves no time to prepare. When illness took her husband and left behind more than grief, it left unanswered debts, unfinished plans, and a silence that settled into every corner of her life. At first, the town responded the way communities often do, with brief gestures of concern, small offerings that carried the appearance of care, but those gestures faded as quickly as they came, replaced by distance that was never openly acknowledged but clearly felt. Clara Hayes found herself navigating days that grew heavier not just because of what she had lost, but because of how quickly she became someone others no longer made space for, and hunger, when it arrives slowly, does not announce itself with urgency, it lingers, it stretches, it forces choices that chip away at pride long before they touch survival. She learned to ration more than food, to measure what little she had with precision, to convince herself that she could manage one more day, then another, and then another, each decision pushing her further into a place where asking for help felt less possible, not because help didn't exist, but because the cost of asking had grown too high. Pride, in her case, was not arrogance, it was the last piece of identity she still controlled, and letting go of it meant accepting a version of herself she was not ready to face. So she endured quietly, absorbing the weight of her situation without drawing attention to it, even as the signs became harder to hide. Even as her strength began to fade in ways others could see but chose not to acknowledge. The rejection she experienced was rarely spoken out loud, it existed in pauses, in avoided eye contact, in conversations that ended too quickly, and over time, that silence became louder than any refusal ever could. Clara Hayes was not unaware of how she was being perceived, she understood that people had begun to place her at a distance, to categorize her struggle as something separate from their own lives, and that understanding made it even harder to reach out, because it confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that her presence no longer carried the same value it once did. Hunger became a constant companion, not just physical, but emotional, a reminder of everything that had shifted beyond her control, and yet she continued to endure without asking, without demanding, without forcing anyone to confront what they had already chosen to ignore. By the time she stood in front of Elias Boone, by the time those words left her mouth, it was not the result of a single moment of desperation, but the conclusion of many smaller moments that had led her there step by step, each one narrowing her options until only one remained, and by then, the decision no longer felt like a choice at all, because by the time she made that decision, she believed she had no other choice. Elias Boone had lived on the edge of Hollow Ridge long enough for his name to become something people repeated without ever needing to confirm, a presence that felt constant but never fully understood, and over time, that absence of clarity turned into something else entirely, a reputation built more on assumption than fact. He spoke little, kept his distance, and moved through life with a kind of restraint that made others uncomfortable, not because it was threatening, but because it offered nothing they could easily interpret, and in a town where people relied on familiarity to feel secure, that silence made him stand out in ways he never tried to explain. The stories about him varied depending on who you asked, some said he had come from trouble, others believed he had left something behind that he refused to speak of, and a few insisted he simply preferred to live without attachment, but none of those stories carried proof, only repetition, and repetition has a way of becoming belief when no one challenges it. People feared him, but no one could say exactly why, and that uncertainty gave their fear a kind of permanence, because without a clear reason, there was nothing to resolve, nothing to confront, only something to avoid. Elias Boone did not correct them, he did not step forward to change how he was seen, and in that silence, the distance between him and the town continued to grow, reinforced by every passing day he chose not to engage. Yet for all the ways he remained apart, he was not unaware of what happened around him. He noticed more than people realized, small details others overlooked, the shifts in behavior, the patterns of who was helped and who was not, and while he rarely acted on what he saw, he carried an understanding of the town that few others did. He avoided people, but he watched everything, and that quiet observation placed him in a position where he saw Clara Hayes long before she ever stood in front of him, saw the gradual change in how she was treated, the way her presence became easier for others to ignore, and though he said nothing, did nothing, that awareness settled somewhere beneath the surface. By the time Clara Hayes approached him, by the time her voice broke the distance he had maintained for so long, the moment was not as unexpected to him as it was to everyone else, because while the town saw two separate stories colliding for the first time, Elias Boone understood that they had been moving toward that point for much longer than anyone had noticed. By the time Clara Hayes reached the far edge of Hollow Ridge, the distance behind her carried more than footsteps, it carried every door that had closed, every glance that had turned away, every moment that had quietly confirmed what she had begun to believe about her place in the world, and though her body showed the strain of days without enough to sustain it, what brought her forward was not just hunger, it was the weight of knowing there was nowhere else left to go. Elias Boone had already seen her before she stopped, not in a way that drew attention, but in the same quiet way he noticed everything, a still presence watching without interruption, without judgment spoken aloud, and as she approached, the space between them held a kind of tension the town could feel even from a distance, because this was not a meeting anyone expected to happen, not between these two, not under these circumstances. Clara Hayes stood there for a moment longer than most would have, as if gathering the last of something she had been holding onto, something that had already been worn thin by everything that came before, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that did not come from confidence, but from certainty that there was nothing left to lose. "Take me. I will bear you children." The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and undeniable, and for a brief moment, everything around them seemed to pause, as if the town itself needed time to understand what had just been said. From a distance, people watched, not stepping closer, not turning away either, caught between curiosity and discomfort, each forming their own version of what this meant, some seeing it as desperation, others as something more calculated, and a few choosing not to look too closely at all. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with unspoken questions. Was this survival, a final attempt to secure what she needed to endure another day? Was it sacrifice, an offering shaped by everything she had lost, or was it something else entirely, something deeper that neither side fully understood yet? Elias Boone did not respond immediately, and in that pause, the weight of the moment grew, because the town expected one kind of answer, one that would confirm what they already believed about him, but what they did not expect was the absence of reaction, the lack of visible emotion, the quiet consideration that did not match the image they had created. Clara Hayes did not look away, even as the silence stretched, even as the outcome remained uncertain, and in that stillness, there was a clarity that neither of them needed to explain, because whatever happened next would define more than just this moment, it would shape everything that followed. And then, he said yes. Elias Boone did not offer an explanation, not to Clara Hayes and certainly not to the town that watched from a distance. He simply turned and walked, and after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, Clara followed, leaving behind the only place she had left to stand and stepping into something no one around them could clearly define. The walk itself was quiet, not marked by conversation or reassurance, just two people moving forward with an understanding that did not need to be spoken, and as they disappeared beyond the line where the town ended and his land began, the absence of clarity became something the town could not ignore. By the time word spread, it carried more than the moment itself, it carried interpretation, reshaped in every retelling, sharpened in tone, softened in some corners, but never neutral, because no one was willing to leave it without meaning. Some said Clara Hayes had made a decision she would regret, others claimed she had done what she had to do, framing it as survival dressed in difficult terms, and a few insisted that Elias Boone had simply revealed what they had always suspected about him, that his distance had never been about solitude, but something they believed was now confirmed. Women in the town spoke about her in ways that revealed as much about themselves as it did about Clara. Some saw her and recognized the quiet desperation that could exist beneath a composed surface, understanding how close any life could come to that edge without warning, while others drew a line between themselves and her, holding on to the belief that they would never make such a choice, not acknowledging how circumstances can narrow options until choice itself becomes something else entirely. Conversations formed in small groups, behind closed doors and across open spaces, where voices lowered just enough to signal discretion but not enough to prevent the message from spreading, and with each exchange, the story became less about what actually happened and more about what people needed it to represent. Clara Hayes was no longer just a woman who had struggled, she became a symbol of something the town could discuss without confronting their own role in it, and Elias Boone, as always, remained distant, unchanged in his outward behavior, offering nothing that would confirm or deny what was being said about him. But what people thought was happening wasn't the truth, and the further their assumptions moved from reality, the more difficult it became to recognize what was actually unfolding beyond their view. In the days that followed, the version of events circulating through Hollow Ridge grew more certain with every retelling, even as the truth itself remained out of sight, shaped instead by distance and assumption rather than observation. What the town believed was simple, almost predictable in its framing, that Clara Hayes had exchanged one form of hardship for another, that Elias Boone had taken her in under conditions that matched the story people had already decided to believe, and because no one was close enough to see otherwise, those beliefs settled into something that felt permanent. But beyond the edges of those assumptions, in the quiet space where Elias Boone lived, a different reality was taking form, one that did not match the expectations placed upon it. Clara Hayes was given food, not in a way that suggested ownership or obligation, but in a way that restored what had been taken from her over time, steady, sufficient, without demand attached, and she was given shelter, a place that offered rest without condition, something she had not experienced in longer than she could clearly remember. What did not happen became just as important as what did, because Elias Boone did not approach her in the way the town imagined, he did not claim what had been offered, did not treat her presence as something owed, and in that absence of action, a different kind of understanding began to take shape, one that neither of them spoke about directly but both recognized in their own way. The silence between them was not empty, it carried a weight of shared awareness, two people who had arrived at this moment from very different paths, now existing within the same space without forcing it into something it was not. There were details about Elias Boone that Clara began to notice, small indications that his distance from others was not rooted in indifference, but in something more complex, something tied to a past he had not spoken about but had not entirely left behind either, moments where his attention lingered longer than expected, where his actions suggested familiarity with loss, even if he never named it. These were not things the town could see, and so they continued to fill the gaps with their own conclusions, convinced that Clara Hayes had been taken advantage of, that Elias Boone had accepted her offer in the way they had anticipated, reinforcing the narrative that made the most sense to them. But as time moved forward, the truth continued to separate itself from those assumptions, quietly, steadily, revealing that what existed between Clara Hayes and Elias Boone was not defined by the words that brought them together, but by what followed after, and that difference, though still unseen by the town, was beginning to reshape everything in ways no one had yet recognized. As the days turned into something steadier, something neither Clara Hayes nor Elias Boone had planned but both had quietly accepted, the distance between perception and truth continued to widen in ways the town could not see, and perhaps would not have understood even if they had. Clara Hayes, who once measured her days by what she lacked, began to regain something far less visible but far more important, a sense of self that had been slowly stripped away not just by hardship, but by the silence of those around her, and in its place, something stronger began to form, not built on what she could offer, but on what she still was, even after everything she had endured. Elias Boone remained who he had always been on the surface, quiet, reserved, unchanged in the eyes of Hollow Ridge, but beneath that stillness, there was a shift that did not need to be announced, only lived, a decision to act where others had chosen not to, a choice that redefined not only how Clara Hayes would move forward, but how his own past would continue to shape him. The town, for all its certainty, never fully corrected itself, because acknowledgement requires reflection, and reflection is often the hardest step to take, especially when it reveals more than people are willing to accept about their own inaction. What they saw was a moment, something they believed they understood from the outside, but what they missed was everything that came after, the quiet rebuilding, the unspoken understanding, the absence of the very thing they had assumed defined the entire situation. Clara Hayes was never what they reduced her to, and Elias Boone was never what they feared him to be, and somewhere between those two truths lies the part of this story that matters most, the part that asks not what happened, but why it was allowed to happen in the first place. Because in the end, it was not the offer that defined Clara Hayes, and it was not the acceptance that defined Elias Boone, it was what followed, what was chosen when no one was watching, what was given without expectation, and what was restored without being asked for. Let us know in the comments what you would have done, and if stories like this remind you what truly matters, subscribe, because the next one might stay with you even longer.